Okay, think about modern conflict for a second. With everything from great power rivalry to cyber warfare and this constant, intense media spotlight, it's about so much more than just winning the single fight, right? It's about navigating this incredibly complex world where every single military action has political consequences that, just ripple out across the globe. So let's dive into this and explore why a little bit of philosophy might actually be a modern officer's most powerful weapon.
And this right here, this really gets to the heart of the problem we're talking about today. You can have the most cutting-edge tech, the absolute best soldiers, but if all those tactical victories don't add up to a coherent political goal, you run the risk of winning every single battle but still, somehow, losing the war. It's this idea that without a solid strategy, even the most brilliant moves on the ground can lead you straight into a dead end.
And this is the foundational idea, the one that really started it all, from the famous military theorist Karl von Clausewitz. What he's saying is that every military action is a political act, period. So if leaders on the ground don't get the political context they're operating in, there's just no way they can make sound strategic judgments. This one simple quote is basically the why behind everything else we're about to get into. So here is our game plan. We're going to start with that core problem, the big difference between winning battles and actually winning wars. Then we'll open up a toolkit for strategy. From there, we'll look at the world through 4 different lenses on power, see how all this theory gets put into practice, and finally, we'll paint a picture of what a modern, strategically literate officer really looks like. All right, let's jump into our first section, winning battles versus winning wars. And this isn't just some, abstract idea. It points to a very real danger in modern conflict, something called strategic myopia.
Strategic myopia? It's basically just a fancy term for tunnel vision. It's what happens when a military gets really good at the how to take a hill, how to execute an operation perfectly, but completely loses sight of the why. Why are we even here? What political outcome is this specific action supposed to achieve? Without that connection, even the most flawlessly executed operations can end up as strategic failures.
So, if that's the problem, how do you fix it? How do you combat this myopia? Well, the answer isn't just more drills or more hardware. It's about upgrading the mental software of military leaders. And that brings us right to our second section, building a toolkit for strategy, and why something that sounds super academic, international relations theory, is actually the key. Now, I know what you're thinking. When you hear the word theory, it's easy to picture dusty old books and boring classroom debates. But in this context, you gotta throw that idea out the window. The source material we're looking at here frames IR theory as something totally practical. It's an operational enabler. It directly makes a commander's judgment better when it counts, out in the field. And check out how practical these benefits are. IR theory gives officers mental models, frameworks to make sense of a really chaotic world. It helps them speak the same language as civilian policymakers, it helps them work better with allies, and this one's huge. It helps them think 2 or 3 steps ahead about the unintended consequences of their actions. You know the ripple effects? Okay, so let's crack open this toolkit. We're going to look at 4 really powerful ways of seeing the world, all drawn from major IR theories. And it's super important to think of these not as strict rules, but more like different lenses you can put on. Each one helps you see a situation from a totally new angle and spot things you might have missed otherwise. First up, we've got realism. This is the classic, kind of hard-nosed view of the world. The basic idea is that in a world where there's no global 911 you can call, a state of what they call anarchy, nations have to rely on their own power to survive. It's all about national interest, security, and that constant jockeying for the balance of power. So, for a military leader, looking through a realist lens is just invaluable. It forces you to constantly think about deterrence. How do you prevent a fight before it even starts? It makes you hyper-aware of the risks of escalation. And it's a constant reminder not to assume another country is going to act against its own security interests just because you think you share the same values. Okay, let's switch to our next lens, liberalism. Now, this view doesn't ignore power, not at all, but it argues that cooperation isn't just possible, it's actually pretty common. Liberalism focuses on how international institutions, like the UN, alliances like NATO, and shared democratic values can create a more orderly, more predictable world for everyone. And this is the reality of modern military operations, right? Very few missions these days are done alone. So a liberal lens is absolutely essential for managing coalitions, for operating under international mandates, and for understanding that legitimacy, the belief that what you're doing is lawful and just, is a critical part of the operation itself. Our third lens, constructivism, takes a really fascinating turn. It argues that things we take for granted, like national interest or who counts as a threat, aren't just fixed realities out there in the world. They're actually ideas that we all build together through our language and our interactions. The famous line here is, "Anarchy is what states make of it," which basically means a relationship between two countries can be one of fierce rivalry or close friendship, and it all depends on the ideas and norms that are shaping it. This is exactly why constructivism is the theory for what you might call the battlespace of meaning. It explains perfectly why a military operation's success can totally hinge on whether people see it as an act of liberation or an act of occupation. So for anyone working in strategic communications or influence operations, this lens is non-negotiable. It's essential. All right, our final lens asks us to be critical and reflexive. In other words, to turn the camera around and point it back at ourselves. This perspective challenges us to step back and ask some pretty uncomfortable questions. Questions like, who really benefits from this specific definition of security? How do hidden power structures based on race, class, or gender shape our own institutions? And the really powerful quote here is that theory is always for someone and for some purpose. It's never neutral. In the real world, this lens is all about self-awareness and ethics. It pushes military leaders to be more culturally sensitive, to try and anticipate how their actions might be seen by all kinds of different groups, and to double down on their commitment to democratic accountability and protecting civilians. It really strengthens the moral authority of the force. This summary table just lays it all out so clearly. You've got the theory on the left, its mean focus in the middle, and then, the most important part, its direct, practical relevance for military professionals on the right. You can see how each lens, from realism's focus on deterrence to constructivism's focus on communications, gives you a unique and totally necessary tool for making better judgments. Okay, so we've got these 4 powerful lenses in our toolkit, but how do you get them out of a textbook and into the split-second decision-making of a commander in the field? Well, that brings us to our next section, putting theory into practice, taking it from the classroom right into the command post. And it happens through these really dynamic, hands-on methods. Wargaming lets officers play out crises and see how different assumptions, say a realist versus a liberal worldview, can lead to wildly different outcomes. Case studies of past conflicts show how these theories actually played out in the real world. And red teaming, well, that forces officers to think like the adversary, to really challenge their own biases head-on. The whole point of all this is to turn theory into a lived skill. It's about building mental muscle memory. That way, when a real crisis hits, a leader has this rich set of mental frameworks they can draw from instantly, which helps them anticipate what's coming next and just make better decisions under incredible pressure. Which brings us to our final section, and really the end goal of this whole effort. What does the ideal strategically literate officer actually look like in the 21st century? At the end of the day, an officer who's grounded in this kind of thinking is just more effective. They can get inside an adversary's head better. They can navigate the complicated politics of alliances. They can protect the legitimacy of their mission. And most importantly, they can make sure that every single action on the battlefield is directly tied to achieving a clear political goal. In other words, they can avoid that strategic myopia we talked about at the beginning. And that leaves us with one final question to chew on. In the incredibly complex conflicts of today, where a story or a perception can be just as powerful as a missile, what truly weighs more in the skills of victory? Raw firepower or the legitimacy of the cause it serves?